He showed up to that blind date in a jacket with a frayed collar, rehearsing his apology for leaving early. She showed up in a grocery store cardigan, hoping he'd find her boring enough to never call again. Neither of them planned to feel anything. Neither of them planned to stay. But somewhere between the bad coffee and the honest silence, something shifted, and neither of them knew yet that this accidental evening would cost them both everything they'd spent years protecting. If this kind of story speaks to you, real, messy, and worth fighting for, hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now settle in. This one goes deep. The blind date had been Marcus's idea, which meant it was already a bad one. Ethan Brooks figured that out around the time he was standing in front of his bathroom mirror at 6:40 on a Tuesday evening, trying to decide if the navy jacket still looked professional or just sad. He'd owned it for 4 years. He'd worn it to parent-teacher conferences, to his brother-in-law's retirement dinner, to his wife's funeral. It still fit. That was about all he could say for it. "Dad?" Lily's voice came from the hallway, muffled slightly by the door. "You're doing the mirror thing." "I'm not doing any mirror thing. You've been in there for 11 minutes. He checked his watch. She wasn't wrong. He opened the door. Lily was leaning against the wall across the hall with her arms folded and her dark hair still damp from her shower, looking at him with the particular brand of patience that 9-year-olds deploy when they're trying very hard not to roll their eyes at their fathers. "It's just coffee," she said. "I know it's just coffee. Uncle Marcus said she's nice." "Uncle Marcus thinks everyone is nice. He also thought the Thai place on Clement was nice, and we both had food poisoning for 3 days. Lily considered this. "That's a valid point." She pushed off the wall and reached up to straighten his collar, matter of fact, the way she did everything. "You look fine, Dad. You look like you." He caught her hand before she pulled away and held it for a second. She let him. She was getting to the age where she sometimes didn't. "Mrs. Patterson's number is on the fridge," he said. "Bedtime is 9:30, I know. 9 o'clock. You said 9:30 last week. I said 9:15 and you negotiated me up." He kissed the top of her head. 9:15, final answer. She smiled the smile that looked like her mother's and pulled away toward the living room, already done with the conversation. He watched her go for a moment, then picked up his keys from the hook by the door. Outside, the San Francisco evening was doing its typical thing. The fog already rolling in off the bay, the air carrying that particular cold that was never quite cold enough to justify a real coat, but always too cold to ignore. He walked 3 blocks to his car and spent the drive to the coffee shop, reminding himself that Marcus meant well, that 1 hour was survivable, and that Lily was right. It was just coffee. He didn't let himself think about Claire. He almost never let himself think about Claire anymore. At least not consciously, not on purpose. She just existed somewhere below the surface of everything, a kind of persistent weather. The coffee shop Marcus had chosen was called Groundwork, which Ethan thought was either the most pretentious name for a cafe he'd ever heard or accidentally profound. It was on a quiet block in the inner Richmond, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and jazz coming out of speakers that looked too small to be producing that much sound. He arrived 4 minutes early and stood outside for 2 of them, which he recognized as slightly pathetic behavior, and did anyway. He went in, ordered a black coffee at the counter, found a corner table where he could see the door. She arrived at 7:02. He almost missed her, actually. He'd been watching the door for someone who matched the photograph Marcus had texted him. A formal headshot, professional smile, dark hair blown out properly. And the woman who came in didn't quite match that. She was wearing a beige cardigan over jeans, the kind of outfit that didn't ask anything of anyone. Her hair was pulled back in a way that looked more like an afterthought than a style. She paused inside the doorway and scanned the room with the careful expression of someone doing a calculation, and then her eyes found him, and she walked over. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. Victoria?" "Unfortunately." She said it with a slight wince that he couldn't tell was self-deprecating humor or genuine regret. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without any of the usual first date ceremony. No extended handshake, no comment about the weather, no performance of enthusiasm. She just sat, put her bag on the floor, and looked at him directly. My brother was very insistent about this. My brother was enthusiastic, Ethan said. I've been trying to figure out if that's a warning sign. Almost certainly. She looked toward the counter. I'm going to need coffee before I can make any of the small talk we're supposed to do. I already ordered mine. Go ahead. She got up, went to the counter, and came back 3 minutes later with a ceramic mug of something that smelled like it involved oat milk. She wrapped both hands around it, took a sip, and visibly relaxed exactly 1 degree. Okay, she said. The standard script is we ask each other what we do, pretend to find the answers more interesting than we do, and then either exchange numbers out of politeness or come up with an excuse to leave early, or we could skip that. Ethan leaned back in his chair. What do we do instead? I have no idea. I haven't done this in a while. How long is a while? She thought about it. 3 years? 4 maybe? I stopped counting. Same, he said. And because she'd been direct, he matched it. I'm a widower. My wife died 5 years ago. I have a 9-year-old daughter. I'm a high school history teacher. I live in the Sunset District. That's most of the biography. Something moved across her face, brief and careful, and then she said, I'm sorry about your wife. Thank you. He'd gotten good at accepting condolences without derailing whatever conversation was happening around them. What about you? She took another sip of her coffee. Not widowed, just burned. She said it lightly, the way people say things they've practiced being light about. A relationship that ended badly. It took a while to want to try again, and honestly, I'm still not sure I do, which is probably unfair to you. I appreciate the honesty. I'm too tired to be anything else. She looked at him with something that was almost a smile. Your brother didn't tell you anything about me? He said you were smart, kind, and interesting, possibly in that order. And your assessment so far? Ethan considered. Smart, definitely. Kind, too early to say. Interesting enough that I haven't looked at my phone. This time she actually smiled, small and a little reluctant, like she hadn't meant to. That's a low bar. It's a first date. I'm calibrating. No. They stayed for 2 hours. Ethan hadn't planned on 2 hours. He'd planned on 1. Get there on time, be polite, leave without making it awkward, go home and tell Lily it was fine, but nothing special. That had been the plan. But the conversation didn't stop the way he'd expected it to. They talked about books, she read obsessively, across genres, the kind of reader who had strong opinions about whether a novel's ending had been earned. He was more selective, mostly history and the occasional thriller, but he'd read enough to hold his ground. They argued mildly about whether a famous historical novel had been overrated, and then more seriously about whether certain events in American history were taught honestly in high schools, which led to a longer conversation about the particular difficulty of teaching teenagers to think critically about narratives they'd already accepted as fact. She was engaged in a way that surprised him, not performing engagement, actually interested, leaning forward slightly when she had a point to make, not looking at her phone, not trailing off into polite half-attention. She asked real questions and listened to the answers. What she didn't do was talk much about herself. He noticed it but didn't push. She mentioned her brother, Daniel, who'd set up the date, with the kind of exasperated affection that told him they were close. She said something vague about work being complicated lately, and when he asked what kind of work, she said business without elaborating, and redirected. He let her redirect. Everyone was allowed their edges. When he finally noticed the time and said he needed to get back to his daughter, she nodded immediately, no trace of offense. Right. Yeah. Of course. She started pulling her jacket on, then paused. This was not what I expected. Bad or good? She thought about it with that same deliberate honesty she'd been using all evening. Surprisingly good, which is slightly inconvenient. He laughed, genuine, the first real laugh he'd had in what felt like a while. I know what you mean. They walked out together and stood on the sidewalk while the fog did its cold, damp thing around them. There was a beat where either of them could have said something neat and conclusive. Neither of them did. My brother is going to ask me how this went, he said finally. What are you going to tell him? I'll tell him it was fine. That's it? He doesn't need to feel too vindicated. He looked at her for a second. Can I have your number? She studied him for a moment, and he had the sense she was deciding something real. Then she took out her phone and they exchanged numbers, and she walked off toward the Mooney stop without looking back. He stood there for a moment in the cold. Then he texted Marcus. It was fine. Don't read into it. Marcus texted back 3 seconds later. Called it. She texted him 2 days later. Not a long text, just a title, a book she'd mentioned during their conversation, with the message, "This is the one I was talking about. The ending is lazy, and you'll agree with me." He bought the book that weekend. The ending was not lazy, and he told her so, and they argued about it over text for 3 days, with the kind of back and forth that had both of them checking their phones more than was probably appropriate for fully grown adults. He asked if she wanted to get coffee again. She said she didn't really want coffee, but she'd heard there was a used bookstore on Haight she'd been meaning to go to. He said that sounded like a reasonable second date. She said it wasn't a date, it was a bookstore visit. He said those weren't mutually exclusive. She didn't reply for 20 minutes and then said, "Saturday at 2?" The bookstore was the kind of place that smelled like old paper and possibility. 3 cramped floors of shelving with no discernible organizational logic. The kind of store that rewarded patience and punished people who came in knowing exactly what they wanted. They spent 90 minutes in there, and between them bought 7 books, 4 of which were recommendations they'd made to each other. He noticed things about her in that space that the coffee shop hadn't shown him. She picked books up and read the first page before deciding, which he respected. She had strong instincts and could explain them, which he found rare. She found a battered copy of a novel she'd loved at 16 and stood there holding it for a long moment with an expression he couldn't read. Something private and a little sad, like the book had caught her off guard. She didn't explain it, and he didn't ask. They walked afterward along the Panhandle, coffees in hand, and talked about less safe things than they had the first time. Not secrets exactly, but the edges of secrets. She mentioned the relationship that had burned her, briefly, just enough to give it a shape. Someone she'd trusted who had used information about her life, her work, her vulnerabilities, in a way that had humiliated and exposed her. She didn't name him. She didn't describe what happened in detail. She just said it with a flatness that told him it still sat heavy, and that she'd made a particular kind of decision about trust after it. "I stopped telling people things until I knew who they actually were," she said, "not just who they presented themselves as." That seems reasonable. It's also isolating. She looked straight ahead as she said it, not at him. You can't actually know someone if neither of you is taking any risk. He walked beside her and thought about that. What do you do about it? I'm still figuring that out. She glanced at him then, sideways. Apparently I'm testing whether small disclosures lead to catastrophe. Has this one led to catastrophe yet? Not so far. She almost smiled again. Don't celebrate. Lily found out about Victoria in the way she found out about most things, by asking a direct question at an inconvenient moment. It was a Thursday evening, 3 weeks into whatever this was. Ethan was making pasta at the stove while Lily sat at the kitchen counter, working through a math worksheet with the focused intensity she brought to problems she found mildly annoying but had decided to defeat. "Dad," she said without looking up, "are you talking to someone?" He turned down the heat on the sauce. "What do you mean?" "You've been on your phone more than usual, and you smiled at it twice during dinner last week. I noticed." Ethan set down the wooden spoon. "You noticed that." "I notice things." She finally looked up. Her expression was not accusatory, just careful and curious in the way she got sometimes that made her seem older than she was. "Is it a person?" He considered lying by omission, decided against it. Lily had a talent for detecting it. "Yeah, it's a person. Her name is Victoria. We've gotten coffee a couple times." Lily went back to her worksheet. "What's she like?" "Smart, direct, reads a lot." "Do you like her?" He turned back to the stove and stirred the sauce. "I think so. It's early." "Is she nice?" "She's honest, which is better than nice." Lily seemed to accept this. They ate dinner talking about other things, her science project, whether her teacher was actually going to count the late assignment, and Ethan thought the conversation was over. Then, over his second bowl of pasta, Lily said, "You can invite her to something. If you want, I don't mind." He looked up. She was looking at her plate, casual, but there was something deliberate about the offer. He knew she'd thought about it before saying it. "Okay," he said. "Maybe sometime. I just mean, you don't have to keep it separate from everything. That seems like it would get complicated." He set down his fork. "When did you get this wise?" "I've always been this wise," she said. "You're just catching up." A week later, he invited Victoria to the farmer's market in the outer sunset on a Saturday morning. He mentioned Lily would be there, specifically, and without softening it. There was a pause before she replied. "Okay, I haven't spent a lot of time with kids." "She's not really a kid," he texted back. "She'll tell you what she thinks of you within about 10 minutes, which is either a warning or a selling point, depending on you." Another pause. Then, selling point. He spotted Victoria before she spotted them. She'd come in the same understated way she always did. Dark jacket, no makeup worth mentioning, hair pulled back. She had a reusable bag over one shoulder. When she found them among the stalls, her eyes went to Lily first, quick and assessing, then to him. He raised a hand. Lily did the thing Lily did. She looked at Victoria directly for a full second, absorbing information, and then said, "Hi, I'm Lily. My dad talks about you." Victoria didn't flinch. "He talks about you too. You're in 4th grade?" "5th. He said you're working on a science project. Plant growth and soil composition." Lily's expression shifted slightly, warming by a degree. "Do you know anything about soil science?" "Almost nothing, but I'd like to." This was exactly the right answer, Ethan knew, because it was honest instead of enthusiastic. Lily could smell false enthusiasm from a considerable distance. She nodded and turned toward the nearest stall with the manner of someone who had reached a preliminary verdict. They spent 2 hours at the market. Victoria asked Lily real questions and listened to the answers. She didn't try to be fun or charming or good with kids. She just treated her like a person who had thoughts worth hearing. And Lily, who had always had thoughts worth hearing, responded to this with steady, growing approval. On the drive home, Victoria had taken a lift, said goodbye at the market, and Ethan and Lily were heading back to the sunset. Lily sat in the passenger seat for several blocks in her processing silence. "She's good," she said finally. "Yeah?" "She doesn't talk down. I don't like it when adults talk down." "I know you don't." "And she didn't try to be my friend immediately. Adults do that, and it's always sort of embarrassing for everyone." Ethan kept his eyes on the road and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to add. "I like her," Lily said with the finality of someone issuing a ruling. "I'm just saying." October turned into November, the way San Francisco did it. Not with falling leaves or dramatic temperature drops, but with a deepening of the fog and the way the light went gold and thin earlier each afternoon. He and Victoria fell into patterns the way people do when they're not quite admitting to themselves that something is becoming important. Saturday mornings, usually. Occasional weeknights if Lily had plans with a school friend. They walked a lot. The city was good for that, for the kind of conversation that worked better in motion. She went to Lily's school science fair and stood in front of the soil composition display for a genuine 10 minutes, reading every panel with the same attention she gave books. He was not oblivious to the things she didn't say. She deflected personal questions about her work with the skill of someone who'd practiced it. She never specified her job title, her industry, the size of her company. When money came up, and in the texture of everyday life it came up around the edges, in small ways, there was a carefulness to her responses that he noticed without being able to name it exactly. He assumed she did well. She lived in a nice apartment in Pacific Heights, tasteful, quiet, the kind of place that cost a lot without performing it. She mentioned travel without making it sound extravagant. She paid for things without the specific vigilance of someone watching a budget. None of this was unusual in San Francisco. The city had a way of making everyone's income opaque. He didn't push. He'd agreed implicitly to the deal she'd named on the panhandle. Small disclosures, no catastrophe, patience with the process. But something was there. He could feel the shape of it, some held-back thing, the way you sense weather before it arrives. See, they were at his kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in mid-November when it started to slip. He'd cooked dinner, nothing impressive, roasted chicken and vegetables, the kind of weeknight meal he'd been making for years. Lily was at Marcus's for the night. His brother had offered to take her for a few days so Ethan could have some time to himself, which in Marcus's language meant, use this opportunity, I'm helping you. He'd rolled his eyes at it, but he'd said yes. Victoria had come over for the first time. It was a small thing and not a small thing simultaneously. She'd walked in and looked at the apartment the way she sometimes looked at things she was trying to understand, taking in the bookshelves crammed with both his books and Lily's, the kids' art on the refrigerator, the slightly scuffed hardwood floors, the framed photo of Claire and baby Lily on the shelf above the TV. She hadn't commented on the photo, but he'd seen her look at it, and he'd seen her decide not to say anything about it, and he'd been grateful. During dinner, they were talking about nothing in particular, a documentary she'd watched, a thing that had happened at school, when her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and something crossed her face. A tightening. You can get that, he said. It's nothing urgent. She turned it face down on the table. It's a board thing. Board thing? For work. She picked up her fork. I sit on a few boards. It comes with the territory. What territory is that? She was quiet for just a half-second too long. Running a company. He'd known she ran something. He'd assumed it was mid-size, maybe, something with a few dozen employees. What kind of company? She set her fork down and looked at him, and he saw it. The calculation, the weighing, the things she'd been carrying. Ethan. Yeah, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you something for a while. The kitchen was very quiet. He could hear the refrigerator's hum. Okay, he said. I own Sterling Capital Group. It's an investment firm. We also have a technology subsidiary and 2 real estate holdings. She said it carefully, each word placed deliberately. I'm on the Forbes list, She paused. The women under 40 list. He looked at her. I have a net worth of approximately... She stopped. It's a significant amount of money. The candle he'd lit on the table, because Marcus had also told him to light a candle, and he'd dismissed this as ridiculous and then done it anyway, flickered in the silence. How much, he said, is significant? She told him the number. He sat with it for a long moment. Outside, a car passed on the street. The refrigerator kept humming. Okay, he said. I should have told you sooner. Yeah. He wasn't angry yet. The anger hadn't arrived. He was still somewhere before it. Why didn't you? She met his eyes, and he could see the exact shape of the fear in her face, the real thing under all the careful composure. Because every time I've told someone who I actually am, it changes how they see me. And She stopped, looked away at the wall for a moment. I didn't want you to see me differently. I wanted to just be a person first. You were a person first. I know, but I didn't know that yet with you. She looked back at him. That doesn't make the withholding okay. I understand that. He pushed his chair back from the table, not to leave, just because he needed a different relationship with the room. He got up and walked to the window and looked out at the street. The fog was in. The streetlights blurred and soft. He thought about the last 5 months. Every conversation, the bookstore, the farmer's market, the Wednesday evenings, the way she'd been with Lily. He tried to figure out how much of it had been real, and arrived, with some effort, at the conclusion that all of it had been real. She'd been exactly who she'd appeared to be, which meant the deception hadn't been about who she was. It had been about the specific number attached to her name on a financial publication. That made it better. It also still made it something. He turned around. She was still sitting at the table, watching him with her hands folded and that careful stillness she had that he'd read as composure, but understood now was partly control, the way you hold yourself together when you're not sure what's coming. I need a minute, he said. Okay. Not to process whether I trust you, to process the actual scale of, he gestured vaguely. This. That's fair. He went and sat back down across from her. The chicken was getting cold. Neither of them touched it. Your brother, he said. Daniel, he's also involved in the business. Yes. A beat. The blind date wasn't random, Ethan. Daniel knew you were a good person. He'd heard about you through mutual... She paused. It doesn't matter. He vouched for you before I walked in. He vetted me. Not in a threatening way. In what way, then? in the way you check on someone your sister is going to spend time with. She looked at him steadily. I wasn't set up to be found. I was set up to maybe find someone worth trusting. There's a difference. He sat with that. It didn't feel like a violation exactly. It felt like information about how her life worked, about what she'd had to build around herself to stay safe. He thought about the things she'd told him on the panhandle, the person who'd used her, the flatness in her voice when she'd said it. You've been hurt by it before, he said. The money. She said it without effect. Yes. Different ways, people who saw only that. People who performed not caring about it. People who found out and became someone I didn't recognize anymore. Which one are you worried I'll be? She looked at him for a long moment. The last one, she said quietly. I'm always most worried about the last one. He reached across the table and picked up his fork and took a bite of the chicken, which was indeed cold. She watched him do it. I'm angry, he said. I want to say that clearly, not catastrophically angry, but I feel like I was handed a version of this situation that didn't have the full picture, and I think that matters. It does. I also think you were scared, and I understand being scared of something that's already been used to hurt you. He looked at her. Those two things can both be true. She exhaled slowly, and he saw something ease in her, slightly, not completely. What do we do with it? She said. He picked up his wine. I think you owe me the rest of the picture. Not tonight necessarily, but honestly, over time. Not the financial details. I don't need a line-by-line of your portfolio, but the life, what it actually looks like, what it means. And you? And I promise not to become someone you don't recognize. He looked at her directly. I can't promise it'll be perfectly comfortable. Some of it's going to be uncomfortable for me. I already know that. But I'm not going anywhere because you have money, Victoria. That would be its own kind of stupidity. She looked at him for a long moment, and he watched the calculation in her eyes settle into something that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it. Okay, she said. Okay. He stood up. I'm going to heat this chicken back up because it's genuinely good, and we shouldn't waste it. She stood too, picked up her plate. I'll help. You can set the timer on the microwave. I know how to work a microwave, Ethan. I wasn't assuming. You seem like a person who might have people for that. She gave him a look, sharp and startled, and then laughed. A real one, sudden and unguarded, the first time he'd ever heard her laugh like that. It changed her face completely, made her look younger and slightly undone and completely herself. He stood there for a second, holding both their plates, and thought, there it is. He didn't say that out loud. He carried the plates to the microwave and started the timer, and she stood beside him in his small kitchen in the inner sunset, and neither of them pretended the evening had been easy. But when she left at 11, she touched his arm at the door, brief, deliberate, almost formal, and said, Thank you for not walking out. I thought about it, he said. Honest. I know. She looked at him. That's why thank you. He watched her get into the car that was waiting, and it was a nicer car than he'd noticed before because now he was noticing. And then he closed the door and stood in his hallway for a moment. He was angry still, in a distant, manageable way. He was also something else, something he didn't have a clean word for, something that felt like the particular courage it takes to keep going towards something complicated instead of away from it. He went to wash the dishes. He'd just turned on the tap when his phone lit up on the counter. I'm really glad Daniel made me go, she'd texted. He looked at it for a long moment. Me too, he typed back, and meant it. The anger didn't disappear overnight. Ethan had known it wouldn't. He wasn't the kind of person who processed things cleanly and then filed them away. That had never been how he worked, and Claire used to joke that he was like a dog with a particularly stubborn piece of rope when something was bothering him, worrying at it long after most people would have let it go. He didn't think that was entirely fair as a description, but he didn't think it was entirely wrong either. He spent the 3 days after that Wednesday dinner doing his job, feeding his daughter, answering Marcus's texts with the minimum information required to keep his brother from showing up unannounced, and thinking. Turning the thing over. Not obsessively. He had a classroom full of 15-year-olds who needed him functional and present. But in the background, the way something hums in a wall after you've noticed it. What bothered him, when he got honest about it, wasn't the money. Not exactly. He'd grown up working class in Sacramento, the kind of family where you checked the price of things before putting them in the cart, and he'd spent his adult life in a profession that didn't reward financial ambition. He'd made peace with that, genuinely, a long time ago. The money wasn't the thing. The thing was the gap. The deliberate distance between what she'd let him see and what was actually there. He kept going back to specific moments. The farmer's market, where she'd traveled by Lyft and bought a bunch of kale without ceremony, where nothing had flagged. The bookstore, where she dug in her bag for her wallet with the same mild expression everyone had. The conversation on the panhandle about trust and small disclosures. You can't actually know someone if neither of you is taking any risk. She'd said that, while sitting on the risk she'd already decided not to take. He understood why. He did. He wasn't unsophisticated about what it meant to be a woman with that kind of money, about what had clearly already been done to her with the knowledge of it. He'd heard the flatness in her voice on the panhandle. He understood the architecture of what she'd built. He just didn't like that he'd been standing outside it, looking through a window she'd left him in front of, thinking he was inside. On the fourth day, she called him. He was grading papers at the kitchen table when his phone buzzed, her name on the screen. He looked at it for 2 rings and then picked up. "Hi," she said. "Hi." A pause. "I wanted to check in. You don't have to have resolved anything. She stopped. "I'm not good at not knowing where things stand." "Neither am I," he said, which was true. He set down his pen. "I'm not going to pretend the last few days were easy. I know. I keep coming back to one thing." He leaned back in his chair. "You told me on one of our early walks that you'd stop telling people things until you knew who they were. And I get that. I do. But somewhere along the way, I thought you'd decided I was safe to know. And then I found out there was still this whole—" He paused, looking for the right word. "Category that you'd kept back." "You were safe," she said, and her voice was quiet. "That was the problem, actually. You were the first person in years who felt safe, and that made me more scared, not less. Because the more it mattered, the more there was to lose." He sat with that for a moment. "That makes sense," he said. "I don't love it, but it makes sense. I'm not asking you to love it. What are you asking?" She took a breath, and he could hear the precision she put into the next sentence, the way she chose things carefully when they mattered. "I'm asking if we can keep going, with the full picture now, and with me trying harder to not protect myself at your expense." He looked out the kitchen window at the gray November sky. "Yeah," he said, "we can keep going." The exhale she let out was small and controlled, but he heard it anyway. What changed after that wasn't dramatic. It was incremental, the way most real changes are. Small adjustments, information coming through in pieces rather than all at once. Each disclosure a kind of test both of them were running simultaneously. She told him about the company over several conversations rather than one. Sterling Capital Group had started as her father's firm. Richard Sterling, a man she described with the specific neutral tone of someone who'd spent years processing complicated feelings into manageable ones. And she'd taken over at 24 when he'd had his first heart attack. She'd rebuilt it from the ground up over the next 6 years, expanded it, shifted its focus, made it into something with her own fingerprints on it rather than her father's. The technology subsidiary had been her initiative. The real estate holdings were a hedge she was actually ambivalent about. She'd inherited that strategy and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. She talked about it the way she talked about books, with genuine engagement, specific opinions, the kind of expertise that was earned rather than performed. He listened. He asked questions. He'd taught economic history long enough to understand the broad strokes, and she filled in the texture. What he noticed was that she talked about the business almost more comfortably than she talked about herself. When the conversation turned to her, to how she felt about things, what she wanted, what she was afraid of, she still got careful in a way the business discussion didn't bring out. She was better at analysis than revelation, he thought. She'd been trained by something or someone to lead with competence rather than interiority. He didn't push at that. He'd chosen patience as his operating mode, and he was trying to stick to it. What she began to see of his life in those weeks was less edited. He'd been reasonably open from the beginning. He didn't have the same architecture of protective withholding, but there were things you could only really understand by proximity. She started to see the texture of his actual days, the grating that spread across the kitchen table after Lily went to bed, the way the school's administration created problems that had nothing to do with teaching and everything to do with bureaucratic self-preservation, the budget he operated inside that required a specific kind of mental math she'd never had to do. When the water heater made a noise he didn't like, and he mentioned it while they were on the phone, she started to say something about fixing it and then stopped herself, visibly recalibrating. He noticed her stopping herself. He didn't say anything then, but he noticed. But December arrived, and with it the particular low-grade chaos of the school year's first semester ending. He had finals to administer, grades to finalize, parent meetings to survive, and a department budget meeting that he already knew was going to accomplish nothing and take 90 minutes to do it. Lily had her own pressures, a social situation at school, the kind that was technically minor and emotionally enormous, a friend group reshuffling in the way fifth-grade friend groups did, with drama that seemed disproportionate until you remembered that to an 11-year-old, almost nothing was disproportionate. Victoria came over on a Thursday evening when Lily was at a sleepover and Ethan was grating on the couch with his socks on the coffee table, which was his version of a controlled environment. She let herself in. He'd given her a key a few weeks earlier, matter-of-factly, the way you give someone a key when they're enough of a presence that the alternative becomes inconvenient. She had a bag from the Thai place 2 blocks over, the one he'd mentioned being good, and she'd immediately looked up and sent a review link to as though research were a reflex. She sat at the far end of the couch from the papers, pulled out the containers, put them on the coffee table, and didn't say anything for a moment. He kept grading. This was something they'd arrived at naturally, the ability to be in the same space without orchestrating it, and he valued it more than she probably knew. "Can I ask you something?" she said. The debt your brother mentioned. Briefly, at Thanksgiving." She handed him a fork without looking at him. "Is it something you're managing okay?" He put down his pen. "Why are you asking?" "Because I've been thinking about it and I want to know." She met his eyes. "Not because I want to fix it, just because it's a real thing in your life and I want to understand it." He looked at her for a moment, then picked up a container of Pad CU and told her about it. The medical debt from Claire's illness, the gap between what insurance had covered and what the last 8 months had actually cost. It had been significant, and he'd been paying it down steadily for 4 years. And it would be gone in another 2 if nothing changed. He laid it out factually, no performance of either stoicism or difficulty. It was a number and a timeline. That was what it was. She listened, and when he was done, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "Just that." "Just okay?" "Just okay. I wanted to understand it. Now I do." She opened her own container. "I'm not going to do anything about it." He studied her. "You want to." The slight pause before she answered confirmed it. "What I want is irrelevant. You didn't give me the information so that I could act on it. You gave it to me because I asked." She picked up her fork. "Those are different situations that require different responses." "That's very evolved of you." "I've been working on it." He looked at her for a moment. The way she said it, flat, real, a little dry, told him she had actually been working on it, that she'd had to consciously override something. He thought about what that cost her, the discipline of it, and felt something warm and uncomfortable simultaneously. "Thank you," he said, "for not doing anything about it." "Don't thank me yet. I'm still working on it." She said it without humor, which meant it was true. He appreciated the honesty more than any comfort would have been. Lily's birthday was the 9th of December, which she shared, as she had often noted, with a mixture of pride and minor grievance, with historical figures she could argue she was related to in some cosmic sense. Ethan always made a small production of it, her choice of dinner, the kind of cake she wanted, a family day without particular agenda. This year she wanted sushi, which she just decided she liked, and she wanted to go to the Science Museum, and she wanted Victoria there. She'd said this last part to Ethan as a statement, not a question, which was how she said things she'd thought about and decided. He'd relayed it to Victoria, who had said yes before he finished the sentence. The morning of Lily's birthday, Ethan woke at 6:30 to the smell of something burning and found Lily in the kitchen attempting to make birthday pancakes for herself, which was a tradition she'd invented at age 7 and refused to relinquish despite the fact that her success rate was roughly 50%. "You don't have to make your own birthday pancakes," he said, for what felt like the 40th time over the years. "I like doing it," she said, not looking up from the pan. "It's tradition." "The tradition is that you make slightly burned pancakes." "The tradition is that I make my own birthday breakfast. The burning is incidental." She slid a pancake onto a plate. It was, objectively, about 40% too brown on one side. She put it in front of him. "Eat. This one's yours." He ate it. It was fine. It was a little burned and fine, and he ate the whole thing while she started another one, and the kitchen smelled like butter and smoke and morning, and he had the kind of moment he sometimes had, sudden, unannounced, where he felt the weight of how much he loved his life. Specifically, this part of it, this kid in this kitchen making imperfect pancakes on her own birthday because she'd decided it was hers to do. He didn't get sentimental about it out loud. Lily found that embarrassing. He just drank his coffee. Victoria arrived at 10, and she had brought exactly one present, wrapped without a bow in the particular way of someone who hadn't wrapped many presents and knew it. Lily opened it with the focused efficiency she applied to all tasks and found a book. A specific book. One she'd mentioned once in passing to Victoria during a conversation about science. A field guide to urban ecosystems that was clearly meant for adults, but that Victoria had apparently decided Lily was ready for. Lily turned it over, examined the back cover, looked up. "This is actually good," she said. "I thought so." Victoria sat down at the kitchen table as though she'd always sat there. "There's a chapter on soil microbiomes that I thought was relevant to your project." "My project is over." "Future projects." Lily looked at the book again, and something in her face went soft in the way it did sometimes when someone had genuinely understood her. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in the real way, not the courtesy way. The Science Museum was the kind of organized chaos that Ethan had navigated enough times to have opinions about. Go straight to the far wing first, before the school groups arrived. Work backward. He said this at the entrance, and Victoria absorbed it like information worth having. Lily had already decided on her own route and was 3 steps ahead. They moved through the museum in a loose triangle. Lily darting forward, pulling back to explain something, darting forward again. Ethan tracking her peripheral range with the automatic vigilance of years. Victoria matching pace with him, and occasionally getting absorbed in an exhibit herself in a way that made her forget to observe the social situation, which he found quietly charming. There was one moment in the physics wing that he held on to afterward. Lily was trying to figure out a pendulum demonstration, frowning at it with the focused irritation she got with problems she hadn't solved yet. Victoria stepped up beside her and said something Ethan couldn't hear, and Lily listened, and tried it again, and got it, and looked up with the specific bright expression that was only there when she'd learned something she genuinely wanted to know. She said something back to Victoria, and Victoria laughed, and Ethan stood 6 feet away with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the two of them, and the feeling that moved through him then was complicated and real. It wasn't that everything was fine, it wasn't that easy. But standing there in the physics wing, watching his daughter and this woman he was cautiously, carefully falling for figure something out together, he thought, this is actually happening. Not as a warning, as a fact he was still adjusting to. Christmas complicated things, the way Christmas always complicates things in families that don't fit the standard molds. Ethan and Lily had their own traditions. They stayed in the city, had Marcus and his wife Rachel over on Christmas Eve, made too much food, watched old movies that Lily had decided were classics before she was old enough to have seen them. It was quiet and good and theirs. He wasn't going to disrupt it. Victoria's Christmas was a different animal. She mentioned it obliquely over the phone on a Tuesday in mid-December, the careful tone she used when she was navigating something she'd rather not. "My mother does a thing," she said. "A thing. An event. Dinner, but more than dinner. There are about 40 people. It happens every year at the house in Marin." A pause. "She's been asking when she can meet you." Ethan set down the book he'd been pretending to read. "Has she?" "I've mentioned that we're—" She stopped. I've mentioned you. What does she know about me? The relevant things. That you're a teacher, that you have a daughter, that we've been seeing each other for several months. He heard what she wasn't saying, and what was her reaction? The pause this time was a beat longer. He asked follow-up questions. What kind? The kind that were dressed as curiosity. Victoria's voice was level in the way it got when she was maintaining it deliberately. My mother she has opinions about a lot of things. She's not unkind, she's just specific, Ethan offered. That's a diplomatic word for it. She exhaled. I'm not asking you to come to the Christmas thing. I'm telling you it exists and that she knows about you, so you have context. Do you want me to come to the Christmas thing? A pause. That's more complicated. How so? Because I want you there, and I also know what it will be like, and I'm not sure I'm prepared to put you through it quite yet. He thought about this. What would it be like? She was quiet for a moment. My mother built a version of what she thought my life should look like before I'd had a chance to figure out what I wanted it to look like. She's never entirely let that version go. So bringing someone new into her orbit? She paused. She'll be assessing you the whole evening. She'll be polite about it, but you'll know it's happening. Victoria. He kept his voice easy. I'm a high school history teacher. I've been assessed by parents for years. It's basically a job requirement. These are different parents. How much different? She made a sound that was almost a laugh, not quite. She'll have looked you up before you arrive. She'll know exactly what you earn, approximately, and what you own, approximately, and she'll have an opinion about what that means in the context of us. That sounds exhausting for her. It's very exhausting for her. She commits fully. Something shifted in her voice. I just want you to know what you're walking into, if you walk into it. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Is it important to you that I meet her? Eventually, not necessarily at the Christmas thing. Then let's not force it. He sat up. We do our own Christmases this year, and I meet your mother when it's not a 40-person performance. How does that sound? The silence that followed was the kind he'd learned to read. She was doing something with relief, reorganizing something internally. That sounds reasonable, she said. I'm a reasonable man. You're occasionally reasonable, don't oversell it. He smiled at the ceiling, happy to revise down. They spent Christmas Eve separately, which was correct. He had Marcus and Rachel over, and Lily stayed up an hour past her bedtime, being entirely too engaged in an argument about film adaptations with her uncle, and it was loud and cramped, and the turkey wasn't quite as good as last year's, and it was exactly right. Victoria texted at 11:15. How's your night? He texted back, perfect and slightly chaotic. Yours? My mother told 3 separate people I was seeing someone, and they all asked the same questions in different tones of voice. How'd you handle it? I said we were serious and changed the subject, which is either accurate or aspirational. I'm not sure which. He looked at the word serious in the blue light of his phone screen, alone in the kitchen while the voices of his family came through the wall. I think accurate, he typed back. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Yeah, she finally sent. I think so too. January brought rain and the particular restlessness that came after a holiday pause. The world coming back online, the calendar filling up, the sense of acceleration that the new year always produced whether you wanted it to or not. It also brought the invitation. It came through Victoria, delivered over dinner at his place on a Thursday. She'd started cooking sometimes, which turned out to mean she had 3 things she was genuinely good at, and approached all 3 with the systematic focus she brought to everything. She'd made pasta, which was one of the 3, and they were eating when she said, I have something to tell you, and I want you to hear the whole thing before you react. He set down his fork. There's a gala, she said. The Sterling Foundation hosts it annually. It's a fundraiser for the education initiatives we fund. It's actually something you might find meaningful. The programs are real. But it's also... She pressed her lips together briefly. It's a significant event. My company's name is attached. There will be press there. My mother will be there. Various people who know me professionally will be there. He waited. I want you to come, she said. With me. As the person I'm with. She met his eyes. I want to stop not including you in the parts of my life that matter, and this is one of the parts that matters, even if it's uncomfortable. He thought about what she'd said in December. I'm not sure I'm prepared to put you through it quite yet. Something had shifted in those few weeks. He could see it. She was choosing forward rather than careful, and he recognized the effort that cost her. When is it? He said. Third Saturday in February. And what do I wear to a Sterling Foundation gala? Something in her face released, a specific tension that had been in it since she'd started the conversation. I can take care of that. You don't have to... Ethan. She looked at him steadily. Let me do this one thing, not to fix you or dress you up or make some statement, just because I know this world and you don't, and there's no reason you should have to navigate something unfamiliar completely on your own. He thought about it. He thought about what she'd said once about accepting support not being weakness. Something neither of them had fully worked out yet, he suspected, as a principle they could actually live by. He thought about the particular pride he had around his independence, the way he'd constructed it over years, and whether it was always serving him or whether sometimes it was just reflexive. Okay, he said, one thing. One thing, she agreed. They went back to the pasta, and the conversation moved on to other things, and he didn't let himself think too far ahead about a room full of people who knew exactly who Victoria Sterling was and were going to decide in the first 30 seconds exactly who he was. He'd deal with that in February. Oh, that's such a dumb once. Marcus called on a Sunday afternoon in late January, which usually meant he wanted something or had something to say that he considered too important for text. I hear you're going to some gala, Marcus said, skipping hello entirely. Victoria must have talked to Daniel. Daniel mentioned it to Rachel, who mentioned it to me. How are you feeling about it? Ethan was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Lily in her room on a video call with a school friend, the house quiet in its Sunday afternoon way. I'm fine. You always say you're fine when you're not entirely fine. And you always call when Rachel has told you something and you've decided to have an opinion about it. Fair. I do have an opinion. Marcus paused. I think it's good that you're going. I think it matters to her. I also think you should know that it might be uncomfortable in specific ways. Victoria told me that. Did she tell you about the mother? Ethan turned his coffee cup. She told me her mother has opinions. She told Rachel that her mother made some very pointed comments at Christmas about Victoria's personal life and the choices she was making. A beat. Specifically about you. He kept his voice even. What kind of comments? The kind that aren't technically insulting but are designed to make someone feel assessed. I figured. You're not worried? I'm a little worried, he said honestly. But I've been in rooms where I was the least impressive person there before, Marcus. It's not a new experience. That's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about how you'll feel if someone says something about Lily. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. What do you mean? He said. I mean that powerful, opinionated mothers who have specific ideas about who their daughters should be with have a tendency to find the most effective pressure point. And your most effective pressure point is about 4'10" and making noise in the other room right now. He looked toward the hallway. Lily's laugh came faintly through her closed door. Nothing they say about Lily reflects on Lily, he said after a moment. I know that. You know that. But feelings aren't always logical, Ethan. He sat with it for a moment. I'll be fine. I know you will. I just wanted to say it. Marcus's voice shifted to something warmer, less concerned. She's good for you, by the way. Victoria. I can tell. Yeah. He looked at his coffee. She is. Don't screw it up. I'm doing my level best. That's all any of us can do. Marcus paused. What are you wearing to this thing? Victoria's handling it. She's dressing you? She's providing guidance. There's a distinction. There's really not, but whatever helps. Marcus sounded pleased in the way he got when things were going the way he'd hoped they would. Okay, call me after. Boop. I'll text you. That's basically nothing. Call me. He hung up and sat for a moment in the Sunday quiet. Outside the window, the January rain was doing its patient, determined thing, and the street was empty, and the afternoon was gray and ordinary and fine. He thought about February, about a room full of people who moved in Victoria's world, About a woman who'd built everything she had with her own hands and still hadn't figured out that she was allowed to want something for herself. About Lily's laugh coming through a closed door, small and bright, and completely unaware that anyone might try to use her as a measuring stick for something. He refilled his coffee and went back to the papers spread across the table. And the rain kept going, and the afternoon kept turning, and somewhere in Pacific Heights, he suspected, Victoria was working, because she was nearly always working, and maybe thinking about the same February Saturday he was, each of them carrying the weight of what was coming in their own separate, parallel ways, not yet in the same room with it, but headed there. That was something, he thought, being headed somewhere together, even if neither of them was sure exactly what they'd find when they arrived. The suit arrived on a Tuesday. Victoria had handled it the way she handled most logistical problems, efficiently, without ceremony, and with a precision that suggested she'd thought about it more than she let on. A garment bag showed up at his door with a note in her handwriting. "Don't argue. It fits. I had your measurements from the coat you left here." He stood in the hallway holding the bag for a moment, parsing the note, and then he laughed quietly because she'd had the measurements taken from a coat he'd forgotten at her apartment, which was either thoughtful or slightly unnerving, and with Victoria it was usually both simultaneously. The suit was navy, which he appreciated because it wasn't a statement color, and it was cut in a way that was clearly expensive without advertising it. He tried it on in the bathroom mirror, and it fit the way clothes rarely fit off any rack he'd ever shopped from, like it had been built for the specific dimensions of his actual body rather than a statistical average of men his approximate size. Lily came to the doorway while he was looking at himself and went through what had become their standard ritual. She looked at him, performed a brief assessment, and issued a verdict. "You look like you, but more serious," she said. "That's good." "More serious how?" "Like the kind of person people listen to in a room." She leaned against the doorframe. "Victoria picked it?" "She did." Lily nodded slowly. "She knows what she's doing." He looked at himself in the mirror one more time, at the jacket that fit too well, and the fact that he still had the same face, the same hands, the same unremarkable history that no suit could edit. He thought about what Marcus had said about pressure points, and decided to stop thinking about it. "Yeah," he said. "She does." The night of the gala was cold and clear in the way San Francisco was sometimes cold and clear in February. The fog held back for once, the sky doing something with stars that the city usually prevented. He took a car from his apartment because Victoria had suggested this without making it a point of contention, and he'd accepted it the same way he'd accepted the suit, as information about a world he was entering temporarily, not a verdict about his own. She was waiting in the lobby of the event venue, a converted historic building in Soma that had the particular weight of a space designed to impress people who were already impressive. She was wearing something black and structured that made her look like a different version of herself. Not a false version, just a formal one, the one she put on for rooms like this. Her hair was down, which he didn't often see, and she had earrings that caught the light in a way that was subtle and probably cost more than his water heater. She saw him come through the door, and something in her face changed, relaxed by a fraction, then firmed back up. "You look good," she said when he reached her. The suit did most of the work. The suit required something to work with. She straightened his lapel once, briskly, not lingering. "How are you?" "Good." He looked around the lobby, already filling with people in expensive clothes having the kind of conversations that were really about other things. "You?" "Calibrating," she said, which was honest. She took his arm, and the gesture was natural and not natural simultaneously. The first time they'd done this in a context where it meant something publicly, where it would be seen and clocked by people who would have opinions about it. He felt the weight of it. He didn't show the weight of it. The room was large and lit the way large fundraising rooms always were, warm enough to feel welcoming, bright enough that you could see everyone and be seen. The kind of lighting that was designed by someone who understood that how you felt about a room was partly a function of how visible you were in it. There were round tables with elaborate centerpieces that someone had made decisions about, and a stage with a podium and a bar along one wall that was doing significant business, and at least 200 people moving through it with the practiced ease of people who attended events like this regularly enough to have opinions about the canapes. Victoria guided them through the first 20 minutes with the efficiency of someone who knew the terrain, stopping to speak with specific people, not all of them, making selections he couldn't fully decode but that seemed deliberate. She introduced him each time. Ethan Brooks, he teaches history at Lincoln. Not my boyfriend, not someone I'm seeing, just his name and his work, stated clearly, offered as a complete sentence. He understood the choice and respected it. It gave the information without the performance. The reactions varied. Some people were genuinely cordial. A man who ran one of the foundation's partner nonprofits and asked good questions about education policy. A woman who turned out to be on the city's school board and knew his school by name. Others were polite in the way that was really just processing, their eyes doing the quick calculation that Marcus had warned him about, assessing, filing, moving on. He'd been assessed by parents at school, yes, but this was a different frequency of assessment, one that had money and status as its primary coordinates. He didn't perform confidence. He was just himself, which was either enough or it wasn't, and he decided in the car on the way over that he was only capable of the one option anyway. Then Eleanor Sterling appeared. He knew her from the photograph Victoria had shown him once, almost reluctantly. A tall woman in her early 60s with Victoria's same dark eyes and the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where bearing mattered. She crossed toward them with purpose, and Victoria's arm, linked through his, went fractionally tighter for just a moment before she released it, and he noticed but didn't react. Victoria. Eleanor kissed her daughter on the cheek in the formal way of people who'd had complicated dinners about each other. Then her eyes moved to him, and they were exactly what Marcus and Victoria had both warned him about. Intelligent, measuring, missing nothing. "Mother," Victoria said, "this is Ethan Brooks." "Ethan." Eleanor offered her hand, and her grip was firm and brief. "I've heard about you." "I've heard about you too," he said. He kept his tone level and pleasant, matching her register without performing warmth he didn't have. Something moved in her eyes. The response to not being deflected, to having his words come back the same weight she'd thrown them at. "What do you make of all this?" She gestured at the room with the slight sweep of someone who owned the gesture. "The Foundation's work is impressive," he said. "I've looked at the education programs. The mentorship pipeline for first-generation college students is one of the better designed ones I've seen." She looked at him carefully. "You researched it." "Victoria mentioned the gala was for the Foundation. I like to know what I'm supporting when I show up somewhere." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment, and he held hers back without making it a contest, just a fact. Something in her expression shifted, the slightest recalibration. "Victoria tells me you teach history," she said. "American history, mostly. Some world history at the AP level, at a public school." The way she said it wasn't exactly a condescension. It was more like a confirmation of something she'd already categorized. He'd heard that tone before, in different contexts, from people who believed that what you did was a complete sentence about who you were. "Lincoln High School, yes," he said. "It's a good school. The kids are sharp." "I'm sure they are." She paused. "And you have a daughter." "Lily. She's 9. He held Eleanor's gaze steadily. "She's the best person I know." There was a beat. Something crossed Eleanor's face that was harder to read. Not warmth exactly, but the slightest acknowledgement of something unscripted. "That's a very specific compliment," she said. "She's earned it specifically." Victoria had gone slightly still beside him, in the way she went still when she was managing something internally. Eleanor looked at her daughter for a moment, then back at him. "Well," Eleanor said, with the measured tone of someone who hadn't fully decided what she thought, but was not going to show that yet. "I hope you enjoy the evening." And she moved on, toward another cluster of people, with the efficiency of a woman who had things to do. Ethan picked up a glass of water from a passing tray and took a sip. "You okay?" Victoria said quietly. "Yeah. She was exactly who you said she was." He glanced at her. "I'm fine." She studied him for a moment. "You didn't flinch." She wasn't trying to scare me. She was trying to see what I was made of. He looked across the room to where Eleanor had inserted herself into another conversation. That's a reasonable thing to want to know about someone your daughter is serious about. Victoria looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully decode. Most people find her upsetting. Most people probably came in trying to impress her. And you didn't? I came in as myself. He looked at her. If that's not enough for her, that's a problem between you and her, not between me and her. Something moved across Victoria's face, quick and real, and she looked away toward the room, and he thought he saw her jaw work slightly the way it did when she was processing something she hadn't expected to feel. The program portion of the evening was an hour of speakers and a video presentation about the Foundation's programs that was well produced and genuinely moved him, which he hadn't entirely anticipated. There were students who'd gone through the mentorship program talking about what it had meant, and he sat at the table next to Victoria and watched them and thought about his own students, the ones who came in every day carrying weights no 17-year-old should have to carry, and felt the work he did and the work this foundation did connect somewhere real. Beside him, Victoria watched the screen with an expression he'd only seen a few times, unguarded, the careful composure set aside for a moment. She'd built this foundation. She'd made these programs possible. He thought about how easy it would have been to have that kind of money and do nothing meaningful with it, and about the deliberate choices she'd made instead. And he felt the particular respect that isn't about being impressed, but about recognizing something genuine. He didn't say any of that during the program. He just sat there, and at some point his hand was on the table between them, and hers found it, and they sat like that without comment. It was after the program, during the open portion of the evening, that things went sideways. He'd stepped away to find the restroom, left Victoria in conversation with a board member, and was making his way back through the room when he almost walked directly into Eleanor Sterling. She was standing near one of the tall windows with a glass of wine, and it was clear by the way she looked at him that the encounter was not entirely accidental. "A moment," she said. "Not a question." He stopped. "Sure." She looked out the window for a moment, at the city lights and the clear February sky, and then back at him with the directness that was the family trait. "My daughter is not an easy person," she said. "I know that. She's been hurt, more than once. The details are hers to share or not, but," Eleanor paused, precise. "She built her entire professional life specifically because she learned she could trust a company more than she could trust most people. That's not a healthy conclusion, but it's what she arrived at." He kept his voice steady. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want to know if you understand what you're asking of her." Eleanor looked at him directly. "When she brings someone to an event like this, it's not casual. She's never done it before, which means she's made a decision about you that is—" She paused again, choosing the word precisely. "Significant. I know that." "Do you?" She tilted her head slightly, because significant for Victoria means she's exposed, and when she's been exposed before, the consequences were lasting. She held his gaze. "What I'm asking, Mr. Brooks, in the plainest possible language, is whether you intend to stay." The room moved around them, 200 people in expensive clothes having important conversations, and Ethan stood at the window with Victoria's mother and felt the full weight of the question. "I can't give you a guarantee," he said. "That's not how people work, and you know that better than I do." Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, not negative, just attentive. "What I can tell you," he continued, "is that I'm not here performing anything. I'm not here because of who she is professionally or what her name means in a room like this. I was interested in her before I knew any of that, and the knowing of it didn't change what I felt. It made things more complicated for a while, and we worked through it." He looked at Eleanor evenly. "I have a daughter who I love more than anything I've ever known. I understand what it means to love someone completely and to show up for that, even when it's hard. I'm not unfamiliar with staying." The silence between them lasted a few seconds. "She told me about your wife," Eleanor said finally. The edge in her voice had shifted to something less measured, something that might have been, briefly, human. "I'm sorry. Thank you." She looked at him for another moment, and he could see her doing the same thing Victoria did when she was deciding what to trust. Then she said, "She chose well, quietly, like it was a fact she was accepting rather than a compliment she was offering, and she moved away into the room." He stood at the window alone for a moment and let out a slow breath. When he found Victoria again, She was where he'd left her, now standing slightly apart from the board conversation, scanning the room with the measured look she used when she was tracking things. Her eyes found him, and he watched her read his face for information. "What happened?" she said. "You look like you just defended a dissertation." "I had a conversation with your mother." Her expression went careful. "What did she say?" He considered how much to give her and decided on honest. "She wanted to know if I was going to stay." Victoria stared at him. "She asked you that directly?" She got there directly. The approach was slightly oblique. He looked at her. "I told her I couldn't make guarantees, but that I wasn't here performing anything. She said you chose well." Something happened in Victoria's face that he couldn't entirely categorize. Too many things at once, some of them long-standing and complicated, the kind of things that had history in them. She looked away for a moment at the room, then back at him. "She's never said that about anyone," she said, quietly. Not like a statement about him, like a statement about something she was processing. "I got that impression." "Ethan, you don't have to say anything," he said. "I know. I want to." She looked at him directly in the way she did when she was choosing risk. "I know I've made this hard. The withholding, the walls, the careful management of information. I know it's not always easy to be on the other side of that." "No," he agreed. "It's not always easy." "I'm trying," she said. "Not because I think I owe you a performance of trying, because I actually want to." He looked at her in the warm light of this room full of important people, this woman with her careful edges and her foundation that helped teenagers nobody else was helping, who'd put on a formal version of herself tonight, but whose hand had found his in the dark during the program. And he thought about all the ways it would have been easier to have not ended up here, to have begged off Marcus's setup and gone home that first Tuesday and kept the life he'd already built, contained and manageable and safe. "I know you are," he said. "I can tell." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she said, "Can we leave soon? I've done the required amount of this." "Yeah." He looked around the room. 15 minutes? 10. 10, he agreed. They ended up at a small restaurant 3 blocks from the venue, a neighborhood Italian place that was almost aggressively normal compared to where they'd just been. Paper on the tables, house wine in a carafe, a couple at the next table having a quiet argument about something domestic. Victoria had changed into the jacket she'd brought in her bag over the formal dress and was eating pasta with the focused attention she brought to good food. And the controlled composure from the evening had mostly dropped, leaving her just tired and herself. "Your mother cornered me," he said, over his wine. "I know. I saw the 2 of you at the window." She turned pasta around her fork. "I was going to intervene, but you both looked like you had it handled." "Were you worried?" She considered. "I was ready to intervene. There's a difference." "What would you have said?" "I would have told her that who I'm with is my decision and that I'd appreciate her keeping her assessments to herself." She looked at him. "But you didn't need that." "No. That was..." She paused. "I don't know exactly what word I want. Significant. Watching you hold your ground with her." She said it matter-of-factly, without drama. "Most people don't." "I wasn't trying to hold my ground. I was just talking to her." "That's the same thing, with Eleanor." She took a sip of wine. "She's not a bad person. She's just spent 40 years in rooms where the way you held yourself was the entire message, and she's never fully believed that other kinds of rooms exist." He turned his glass. "What happened between you two? If you want to tell me." She was quiet for a moment. "She wanted me to marry into something. Money, stability. Her version of security. There was someone she approved of when I was 27. Someone from the right family, the right background. She thought I was being irrational when I walked away from it." "Why did you walk away from it?" "Because he was boring and I didn't love him, and I thought I deserved better than a strategic marriage." She said it plainly, without drama. She thought I was being romantic in a way that was going to cost me. We argued about it seriously, and things between us have been, she made a gesture, managed since then. "And tonight?" "Tonight she told me you chose well." She looked at him with something complicated in her eyes. "Which is the closest she's come to saying she was wrong about something in about 4 years." He didn't say anything. He poured more wine. She's going to be difficult sometimes, Victoria said. I want you to know that going in. She's going to have opinions about how we do things, about Lily possibly, about Victoria. He waited until she looked at him. I know, and I'm not requiring her to be easy. I'm just asking that when she's difficult, we deal with it together, instead of you trying to manage it before it reaches me. She stared at him for a moment. That's a very specific ask. You have a tendency to pre-protect me from things, he said. I've noticed it. The gala? You almost didn't invite me because you were worried about what I'd encounter. Your mother at Christmas. You pulled the conversation away from it. I understand the instinct, but it also means I spend a lot of time in a version of your life that's been edited for my comfort. She set down her fork. He could see her processing it, the slight tension that appeared when she was deciding whether to be defensive. I do that, she said finally. You do. It's not, she paused. It's not about managing you. It's about protecting what we have from things that might damage it. I know that's what it feels like from your side, he said. From my side, it sometimes feels like being kept at a careful distance from anything messy. He said it without edge, just factual. I don't need it to be clean. I just need it to be real. She looked at the table for a moment. The couple at the next table had resolved their domestic argument, apparently, and were now sharing a dessert. I'll try to stop doing that, she said. The editing. I know it won't be immediate. It might be a recurring problem. Probably. He picked up his fork. We'll figure it out. She looked at him with something that was tired and real and not trying to be anything else. You're remarkably patient for someone who also has a very clear point. I teach 15-year-olds. Patience is occupational. She almost smiled. I was never that difficult at 15. I absolutely do not believe that. This time she actually smiled, small and involuntary, and he thought again, the same thought he'd had in his kitchen the first time she'd laughed like she meant it. There it is. The drive home was quiet, the city moving past the windows in the ways it did late at night, lighter traffic, the streets finding their actual selves. She had her head leaned back against the seat, looking at the ceiling with the exhausted looseness of someone who'd been performing at a high level for 3 hours and was now off the clock. Thank you for tonight, she said. I had a good time, parts of it. The pasta at the end? The pasta was good, he agreed. The program, actually, watching what the foundation does for those kids. He looked at her profile. You built something real, Victoria. It's easy to miss that when it's attached to a gala and a room full of expensive people. But the work itself is real. She was quiet for a moment. It started as my father's legacy project, something I inherited the way I inherited the rest. But over the years, she turned her head slightly toward him. The education work is the part that I'd keep if I had to let go of everything else. I know, he said. I could see it in your face during the program. She turned to look at him fully. What did you see? You looked like yourself, not the formal version, the bookstore version. The car slowed for a light, and in the pause she looked at him with something unguarded, the careful composure completely absent. I love you, she said, quietly and without anticipation, not performing it. The light changed. He reached across and took her hand. I love you too, he said. Also without performance, just the fact of it, settled and real, something that had been building across months of farmers' markets and kitchen tables and difficult conversations and all the ordinary important evidence of a life being shared. She didn't say anything else. She turned her head back to the window and he kept her hand, and the city moved around them. But he didn't know, on that drive home, that 2 weeks later everything would break. He didn't know, because it came from a direction he hadn't been watching. He'd been watching the gala, his own pride, Eleanor's opinion, the things Victoria withheld. He hadn't been watching the debt, the number he'd given Victoria over pasta on a Thursday evening when she'd asked because she wanted to understand, when she'd said, I'm not going to do anything about it, and he'd believed her, because she'd been trying so hard and he'd wanted to believe her. He found out on a Tuesday afternoon in early March. He'd logged into his loan account to schedule that month's payment, as he did every month, methodically, the way he did everything. The balance read 0. He sat in front of his laptop screen for a long moment. Lily was at school. The apartment was very quiet. He checked the transaction history. There was a single payment dated 4 days ago from a financial services address he didn't recognize for the full remaining balance. He sat there for a while, just looking at the number. Then he closed the laptop, got up, walked to the kitchen and stood at the window looking at the street. The fog was back, doing its ordinary thing, indifferent to the specific shape of what he was feeling. He felt, under the anger that was beginning to gather, something worse. The specific hollow sensation of having your trust in someone confirmed and violated in the same moment. Because she had been trying. He knew she had. He'd seen the effort, the deliberate restraint, the conscious override of the impulse to fix. She'd held back at every turn, and then she hadn't, and the thing she'd reached in and fixed without asking was the most personal wound he'd been carrying, the medical debt that had come from losing Claire. He picked up his phone. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, did you pay off my debt?" His voice came out level, which required something from him. A pause. 2 seconds of it, which was all the confirmation he needed. "Ethan, yes or no?" "Yes," quietly. He turned away from the window. "I told you not to. I didn't say it explicitly, but I told you when you said you weren't going to do anything about it, and I thanked you for it. That was a line, Victoria. That was a clear line." "I know." "Then why?" Another pause, longer. "Because I was sitting with my financial advisor last week going over quarterly reports, and the number was just sitting there, and I thought about how long you've been carrying it and how it came from—" She stopped. "It came from losing her. And I thought about you paying it down every month for 4 years, and It wasn't yours to fix," he said. "I know that." "You keep saying you know that." "Because I do know it, and I still did it." Her voice was tight in a way he hadn't heard before, something under the control. "I couldn't sit with the option of fixing it and choose not to. I tried, and I couldn't." He closed his eyes briefly. The anger was real and shaped and specific. Not wild, not devastating, but clean and sharp the way real anger could be when it came from something that actually mattered. "The independence I have," he said, slow and deliberate, "is not a character flaw you can improve on, Victoria. It's something I built. It's something I built for Lily, so she would grow up with a father who handled his own life and didn't need saving." His voice tightened slightly. "The debt from Claire's illness is something I chose to carry the way I chose to carry it, slowly, with my own money, because it was mine to carry." The silence on the line was different from their usual comfortable silences. It had texture in it. "You're telling me you can't trust me now," she said. "Not accusatory, just trying to understand it." "I'm telling you that I don't know what you're going to decide to fix next," he said, "and that I can't have that in my life. Not that way." "Ethan, I need a few days," he said. "I'm not walking away. I'm not ending anything, but I need a few days to sit with this." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful and controlled, which he knew now meant she was containing something significant. "Okay? Okay?" He hung up, stood in his apartment in the fog light of a Tuesday morning, and felt the specific loneliness of being in the middle of something with someone and not being done with them, not even close to done, but needing the space to be angry without either of them making it worse. He went to get Lily from school that afternoon. She talked about a project and a friend and a thing her teacher had said that she found philosophically questionable, and he listened and made dinner and helped with homework and did the whole ordinary architecture of their evening. After she went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and thought about what Victoria had said. "I couldn't sit with the option of fixing it and choose not to." He thought about what that said about her, not the selfishness of it, but the underneath of it. The way she'd sat with the knowledge of his loss, of the 4 years of payments that connected directly to Claire's absence, and hadn't been able to hold that weight and let it remain untouched. He didn't think it was malice. He'd never thought it was malice. He thought it was love doing something love didn't have the right to do without permission. And that was exactly what made it so hard to stay angry at, and also impossible to let go of without addressing. He stayed at the table for a long time that night, the apartment quiet around him, Lily asleep down the hall, the fog pressing softly at the windows. He didn't call her back. Not yet. But he didn't go to sleep without acknowledging, somewhere quiet and private, that whatever happened in the next few days, he wasn't going to let this be the end of them. He just wasn't ready to say that out loud yet. 3 days felt both too long and not long enough. Ethan went through them the way he went through things that were hard, by continuing to function. He graded papers, made dinner, helped Lily study for a social studies quiz she kept insisting she didn't need help with, and then kept asking him questions about. He ran 3 mornings in a row, longer than usual, the kind of run where you're not going anywhere specific, but need the body doing something while the mind works through its material. He called Marcus once and said almost nothing of substance, which Marcus recognized immediately and had the good sense not to push against. What he didn't do was pretend he wasn't thinking about it. The thing about the debt, the specific thing, not the general thing, was that it had reached into a space he'd kept carefully intact. The 4 years of monthly payments had been, in a way he'd never said out loud, his conversation with Claire. His way of finishing something that her death had left unfinished. The bills had arrived while she was still in the ICU, and he'd kept them in a drawer while she was dying, and then she was gone, and the drawer was still there, and the choice to pay it down slowly, himself, from his own salary, was a choice he'd made almost immediately without deliberating because it was the only thing he could think to do that was entirely his. The debt wasn't just a number. It was the last remaining evidence of something he was still in the process of carrying to completion. He hadn't told Victoria any of that, which was part of what was making him sit with the 3 days instead of just calling her. Because if he was being honest, and the running was helping him get to honest, some portion of his anger was at himself, for not explaining what the debt actually meant, for assuming that I'm not going to do anything about it was a permanent position rather than something he should have reinforced with the real context. He'd been guarding the meaning of the thing while leaving her with only the surface of it, and then he'd expected her to treat it with the care that only the full meaning would have justified. That wasn't entirely fair. She'd still crossed a line. She'd chosen to act without permission, and the line was real regardless of the information she'd had access to. But his anger, when he followed it back to its roots, had some of his own soil in it. On the 3rd night, Lily knocked on his bedroom door at 10:30, which was late for her and therefore meant something. He was sitting on the bed with a book he hadn't been reading. "Come in." She came in and stood in the middle of the room in her pajamas with the expression she wore when she'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided to stop thinking and just say it. "Are you and Victoria fighting?" He looked at her. "Why do you ask? You haven't mentioned her in 3 days. You mention her most days, usually, and you went running for like an hour this morning." He set the book down. "We had a disagreement about something." Lily absorbed this. "Is it bad?" "It's the kind of thing that needs to be worked through," he said carefully. "But you're going to work through it?" He looked at his daughter, at the careful stillness she'd learned, the way she held herself when she was worried about something but trying not to show it, which was so much like the way he held himself that it sometimes stopped him cold. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." She nodded slowly. "Okay." She stood there for another moment. "She makes you different," she said. Not changed, just more like yourself. I don't know if that makes sense." He held her gaze. "It makes sense. So whatever it is, it seems worth fixing." She said it with the practical directness she applied to most things, then turned to go back to her room. At the door she paused. "Also, you've been grouchy at dinner, and you never do that." "I haven't been grouchy." "Dad." She looked back at him with profound patience. "You graded a perfectly good paper a B+ because the margins were uneven." He opened his mouth, closed it. "Good night," she said, and disappeared down the hall. He sat there for a moment, then picked up his phone. He called her at 11, which was late, and she picked up immediately, which meant she hadn't been asleep. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He leaned back against the headboard. "Can we talk tomorrow?" "Actually talk?" "Yes." No hesitation. "Where?" "The Panhandle, 10 o'clock. Lily's got a play date." "Okay." A pause. "Ethan, I've been writing you an explanation in my head for 3 days. I have a very thorough version of it." "I know you do." "I also know a thorough explanation isn't the same as an apology." He looked at the ceiling. "We'll talk tomorrow." The silence was different from the one after the debt conversation, so less jagged, more uncertain. Two people holding something fragile between them, being careful not to move too quickly. "Okay," she said. "Tomorrow." The Panhandle was quiet at 10 on a Saturday morning. Dog walkers and joggers, and the occasional parent with a stroller. The eucalyptus trees doing their tall, indifferent thing above the path. He got there first and stood by the same stretch of path where, months ago, she'd told him about the person who'd burned her and about making decisions about trust. She arrived exactly at 10, no jacket over her sweater, because she always underestimated the San Francisco cold and never admitted it. She stopped about 3 feet from him and looked at him with the undefended expression she rarely wore in rooms where anyone else could see it. "I'll go first," she said. "Okay." She took a breath. "What I did was wrong. Not in a technical sense. I have the resources. The intent was good. I didn't do it to control you. But those things don't actually matter because I did it without your knowledge and without your permission into a part of your life that you'd specifically told me you were handling on your own terms." She held his gaze steadily. "I told you I wouldn't. You thanked me for that. And then I did it anyway because when I'm sitting with the option of making a problem disappear and I love the person who has the problem, something in me decides that the love justifies the override." She stopped. "It doesn't. I know that. And I'm sorry." He walked beside her in the direction of nothing in particular. She fell into step with him. "I need to tell you something I didn't tell you before," he said after a moment. "Okay?" The debt wasn't just medical bills. He kept his eyes on the path ahead. "I mean, it was, technically, but I've been paying it down the way I have, slowly, monthly, from my own salary, because it felt like the last thing I could do for Claire." He heard himself say it and felt the awkwardness of saying something true that he'd kept internal for years. "The bills came in while she was still alive. I kept them in a drawer. And after she died, paying them down felt like finishing something. Something that was mine to finish." He paused. "I never told you that." Victoria walked beside him without speaking for a moment. "No," she said, "you didn't. Which means I gave you the information with none of the meaning, and then I expected you to treat it with the care that only the meaning would have justified." He glanced at her. "That's not entirely fair." "It doesn't change what I did," she said carefully. "No, but it's part of the picture." He stopped walking. She stopped too. The eucalyptus moved above them in the light wind. "I'm not good at explaining the interior stuff, the why things mean what they mean. I do it with Lily, I've learned to do it with Lily, but with adults I tend to just assume people can infer it." He looked at her directly. "I should have told you what that debt was. Not so you'd leave it alone. You should have left it alone regardless, but because you're the person I'm with, and the real things should be sayable." She looked at him, and he could see her processing the responsibility being shared between them, redistributed from the tidy guilt she'd been carrying to something more complicated and more honest. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah." "What do you need from me going forward, specifically, not in general terms?" She held his gaze. "What does it actually look like? Me not crossing that line." He thought about it genuinely. "You ask first. Every time. Even if you're certain I'll say no. Even if watching me carry something is uncomfortable." He paused. "And when I say no, you let it be no without a counteroffer." "That's going to be hard for me." "I know." "I'm not saying no. I'm just naming the difficulty." "I know," he said again. "And I need you to know that it goes the other direction too. If you're in a situation where my pride is making both of us worse off, where I'm refusing help that actually makes sense to accept, I want you to be able to say that to me directly." He looked at her. "Not fix it. Say it." She held his gaze for a moment. "That I can do." "Then we have an agreement." She exhaled, slow and controlled in the way she controlled things, but he caught the relief in it. They started walking again, and for a few minutes they just walked, the morning moving around them. "I need to tell you something else," she said. "Okay." "I transferred the money into an account in your name, the amount. It's sitting there." She kept her eyes forward. I'm not going to pretend I did it as a gift. I did it unilaterally, which was wrong, and if you want to reverse it, pay it back, whatever, I'll make that possible. But I wanted you to know I didn't just—" She paused. "I didn't just vanish it. The money is yours to decide what to do with." He thought about this as they walked. The debt itself was gone. That part was done. The account she'd described, sitting with his name attached to it, was a different question. "Give it to the foundation," he said finally. "The education programs." She stopped walking. He stopped too. "Ethan, it's the right amount for a scholarship," he said. "One student, 1 year, fully funded. You can figure out the details. But that's what I want to do with it." He looked at her. "That way it goes somewhere it should go, and I don't have to figure out how to sit with having accepted it." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was working through something it didn't have a clean expression for. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She nodded, slowly. "Okay." "Okay." He started walking again. "Now can we get coffee, because it's cold and I've been up since 6:30. She fell back into the step beside him, and after a moment her shoulder was against his as they walked. Not dramatic, just present. The ordinary physical fact of two people choosing to be close. He didn't make anything of it. He just let it be there. Pasem. Spring came to San Francisco in the gradual way it always did. Not a dramatic shift, but an accumulation. More days of actual sun, the fog taking longer to arrive in the evenings. The light lasting past 7 and then past 8. Ethan's classroom smelled less like damp jackets and more like the outside air his students dragged in from lunch, and there was a restlessness in the school hallways that always appeared when April came, the particular tension of a school year building toward its end. He and Victoria rebuilt things in the same incremental way they'd built them initially, not through a single large reconstruction, but through daily small choices. She asked before she did things. She didn't always do them when he said not to, which was the point. He told her more of the interior stuff, the meanings behind the facts, and found that it was less difficult than he'd expected, that she received it carefully when he gave it, filed it properly, didn't use it as leverage in any direction. She also, for the first time, let him see the parts of her work that were genuinely hard. There was a board situation in April that she'd been managing for weeks, a conflict between two major shareholders that was threatening a significant acquisition. And instead of presenting him with the resolved version after the fact, she called him one evening while it was still happening, while she was still in the middle of it, and talked through it in real time. He didn't have solutions for her. He wasn't qualified to have solutions for it. But she didn't need solutions. She needed to say it out loud to someone who would hear it as her problem, and not as an opportunity to fix it. "You're frustrated," he said at one point. "Very," she said, and something in her voice had the quality of relief at being allowed to be. That sounds like a reasonable response to the situation. "My COO keeps telling me I'm handling it well." "Are you?" "I don't know," she said. "Probably, but that's not what I need to hear right now." "What do you need?" She was quiet for a moment. "Someone to be annoyed at the situation with me without trying to solve it." The shareholder sounds like an exhausting person. "Incredibly," she said. "He emails at 11 p.m. and then asks why responses are slow. That's actually unconscionable." "Thank you," she said, with feeling, and he could hear the smile in it. He laughed, and she laughed, and the board situation was still there on her end, but it had briefly become just something that was happening instead of something she was carrying alone. Lily's relationship with Victoria had its own weather system, separate from the adults and operating by its own logic. It had deepened over the months in the way Lily's relationships deepened, steadily, observationally, through accumulated evidence rather than emotional declaration. Victoria had learned that Lily's approval was not a performance you could pursue, but a verdict you had to earn through consistency, and she'd apparently decided, somewhere along the way, to simply be consistent and let whatever happened happen. What happened was this. Lily started asking for Victoria specifically, not in a dramatic way, not with the particular vulnerability of a child looking for a parent figure, which Ethan had been quietly watchful for, knowing the risk of it. More the way you start including someone in things you care about because they've proven they take those things seriously. It was science fair season, and Lily had decided on a significantly more ambitious project than the previous year's soil composition study. She was interested in water filtration, specifically in whether improvised filtration methods could produce potable water from tap water compromised by common household contaminants. It was too ambitious for a fifth grader in some respects, and exactly right for Lily in particular. She called Victoria on a Saturday morning while Ethan was doing laundry, and he could hear the conversation from the hallway. Lily at the kitchen table with her notebooks, talking through her methodology with the focused energy she brought to problems she was invested in. Victoria on the other end asking questions that were actually good questions, the kind that came from genuine curiosity rather than performed encouragement. He stood in the hallway listening to his daughter's voice gain intensity as she found the places where her logic held and acknowledged the places where it didn't. And he thought about Lily at 6 months old, the weight of her in his arms the first night after Claire died, the specific terror of understanding that he was all that was standing between this person and the world's indifference. He thought about all the mornings since then, all the pancakes and school drop-offs and homework arguments and negotiated bedtimes. He thought about what it had cost to stay open to this, to not let the loss close him so completely that there was no room left. He went back to the laundry without interrupting them. Pote. Marcus came over for dinner on a Sunday in May, the kind of dinner that was nominally casual and actually his brother checking in on the general state of Ethan's life. Rachel was visiting her mother in Portland, so it was just the two of them, beer and sandwiches at the kitchen table after Lily went to bed. "She's good," Marcus said, meaning Victoria. He'd had dinner with both of them once in April, a low-key thing at a neighborhood restaurant, and had formed his opinion quickly and without ceremony the way Marcus formed most opinions. "Yeah," Ethan said. "The debt thing," Marcus had heard a version of it, enough to understand the shape. "You two worked it out?" "We worked it out." "Good. Because that kind of thing can go one of two ways, and I was worried for a while about which way it was going." "It went the right way." Ethan turned his beer. "It wasn't easy, but it went the right way." Marcus looked at him across the table with the older brother expression, assessing, slightly protective, unwilling to leave the conversation without being sure. "Are you happy?" Ethan considered the word. It wasn't a word he applied to himself often, had learned to be suspicious of it in the way people who'd had something taken from them learned to be careful about the things they named as good. "I'm in a good place," he said. "She's in a good place. Lily's good. Work is—" He shrugged. "Work is what it is." "That's not quite an answer to the question I asked." He looked at his brother. "Yeah," he said. "I'm happy. It's the kind of happy that still has some scared in it, but I think that's just what it looks like now." Marcus nodded slowly. "Claire would have liked her," he said, and then immediately, gently, "Sorry, is that—" "It's okay." Ethan looked at the table for a moment. "Yeah, she would have." He paused. Different personalities, but the same thing underneath. Both of them built something out of not having a choice, and both of them are still figuring out how to trust what they've built. He looked up. "Claire figured it out eventually. I think Victoria's figuring it out." Marcus was quiet for a moment, in the way he went quiet when he'd arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. Then he picked up his beer. "Okay," he said. "Good." They sat with that for a while, the comfortable male silence of two brothers who didn't need to say everything to have said what mattered. June arrived, which meant end-of-year chaos at school, and Lily's science fair, and a conversation that had been building for a while finally finding the right night to arrive. The science fair was on a Thursday evening, and Lily's water filtration project took second place, which she accepted with the focused frustration of someone who was already mentally revising the methodology for next time. Victoria and Ethan stood side by side watching Lily explain her project to the judges with the same pitch she'd rehearsed probably 40 times, and Victoria leaned slightly toward him at one point and said, under her breath, "She should have won." "Second is real," he said. "She had the most original methodology in the room. You're biased." "I'm accurate," Victoria said, with the particular certainty she had about things she'd analyzed carefully. He looked at her profile, at the focused attention she was giving Lily, and felt something he'd been feeling more frequently lately, a kind of settledness, the specific quietness of a life that had found something it had been missing. On the drive home, Lily sat in the back seat in her project presentation clothes, the second-place ribbon in her hand, going over the judge's feedback with the analytical focus she brought to failure as readily as to success. The methodology section was underexplained, she said. The visual aids didn't show the control group clearly enough. That's right, Victoria said from the passenger seat. You told me about the control group, but it wasn't visible in the poster. I ran out of board space. 2 posters next year. The methodology gets its own board. Lily considered this. That would work. She looked down at the ribbon. Second is still real. Very real, Ethan said. Top 3% of the district, Victoria said. I looked it up. Lily looked up. You looked it up? Of course I looked it up. Victoria's tone was matter-of-fact, not performing warmth, just stating a fact. You put months into that project. I wanted to know what the context was. Lily was quiet for a moment in the back seat. Then she said, "Thank you," in the real way. Nobody said anything else for the rest of the drive, which was exactly right. It was a Saturday evening in late June when the conversation happened. Lily was at a sleepover at a classmate's house, and Ethan and Victoria were at his apartment, doing the unremarkable thing they did on those evenings when there was no plan. She was reading on the couch, he was doing something at the kitchen table, and the windows were open because the evening was warm for San Francisco. Actual warm, a small summer miracle. He brought 2 glasses of wine to the couch and sat down beside her, and she put her book face down without being asked. "I've been thinking about something," he said. She looked at him and waited, which was one of the things he'd come to value about her. She didn't preemptively fill silences. "Lily's school year is done," he said. "The lease on this place is up in September." He looked at his wine glass. "I've been thinking about what comes next, for all 3 of us." Victoria held his gaze steadily. "Your apartment has the room," he said. "You've said as much without saying it directly, a few times." "I've thought about it," she confirmed. "What have you thought?" She took a moment. "I've thought that I want you both there, that it's the next real thing, if we're building something real." She paused. "I've also thought about what it means for you, your independence, having a space that's yours." "I've been thinking about that too," he said. "For a while, the independence was the whole point. It was what I was building toward, something I maintained on my own, for Lily, because it was important that she see me doing that. And now?" He looked at her. "Now I think she's seen it. She knows who I am. She knows I built it." He paused. "And I think at some point, stubbornly holding on to the form of independence while the actual life is moving in a different direction stops being a value and starts being a reflex." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant thing to say." "I know. You're not saying it because of pressure." "There's no pressure. You haven't pushed." "I've wanted to push," she said, with the honesty she reserved for things that mattered. "I've thought about it several times and chosen not to, because I knew it had to be yours to decide." "It is mine to decide." He looked at her. "And I've decided I want to. If you want that." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he could see the things she was doing, the careful calculation, the weighing, the old habit of protecting against exposure. He watched her do it, and then watched her put it down. "Yes," she said. "I want that." He nodded slowly. Neither of them moved to make it dramatic. He picked up his wine. She picked up her book. The window stayed open, and the warm air moved through the apartment, and outside the city did its ordinary evening thing, indifferent and continuous. "We should tell Lily," he said, after a few minutes. "How do you think she'll take it?" He thought about it. "She'll ask about her room, specifically whether she can have input on the design. She'll probably negotiate for a dedicated shelf for her science equipment." He paused. "And then she'll say, okay." "That sounds like her." "It is her." Victoria turned a page. "We can look at the rooms this weekend, see which one she'd want." "That works." They sat there in the ordinary quiet of a Saturday evening, and Ethan thought about September, about the lease ending, about a new arrangement of 3 lives into a shared space, all the practical complexity of it, all the things that would be difficult and imperfect and require constant small negotiations. He thought about Lily asking if he was happy, basically, in her roundabout 10-year-old way. about telling Marcus that the happy still had scared in it. The scared was still there. He didn't think it would stop being there, not entirely, not for a while. But it was sitting beside something else now, something stable and warm and real, something that had been built the same way his independence had been built, carefully and out of necessity and with the full knowledge that it could be lost. He looked at Victoria, who was reading again, her feet tucked under her on the couch, her expression absorbed and slightly critical in the way she looked at books that were doing something she approved of. He thought, I chose this. Not just her, the whole of it, the risk of it, the specific courage of loving something after you've already had proof that love isn't permanent. He looked back at his wine and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying, and the warm evening kept moving through the open windows, unhurried, going nowhere in particular, the city outside doing what cities did, continuing regardless into whatever came next. The move happened over 2 weekends in late August. It was not graceful. Ethan had accumulated over 6 years in the Sunset District apartment the particular density of objects that accumulates when a person is too busy to purge and too sentimental to throw anything away without a deliberate decision. There were boxes of Lily's outgrown books that he'd kept because they'd been hers at specific ages and he hadn't been ready to let the ages go. There were 2 boxes labeled Kitchen Mais Esquis that turned out to contain, on inspection, things like a melon baller he'd never used and a hand mixer with a crack in the casing that he'd been meaning to throw out for approximately 3 years. There was a framed poster from a history museum exhibit he'd attended with Claire before Lily was born, still wrapped in the same brown paper he'd wrapped it in when they'd first moved to San Francisco, never quite finding the right wall. Victoria helped, which she'd offered, and he'd accepted, which 6 months ago would have required more internal negotiation than it did now. She showed up on the first Saturday in jeans and a worn-in sweatshirt he'd never seen before, her hair in the kind of ponytail that meant she wasn't thinking about her hair, and she lifted boxes and made decisions alongside him with the practical efficiency she brought to all logistics. It was during the second Saturday, when they were loading the last of the larger items, that Lily found the brown paper package. She'd been helping in the way 10-year-olds helped, sporadically, enthusiastically, and with opinions about where everything should go that were delivered as fact rather than suggestion. She held up the package and said, "What's this?" Ethan looked up from the box he was taping. "Museum poster. From before you were born. Can we open it?" He looked at it for a moment. Victoria, across the room, was carefully wrapping something in newspaper and not looking at him, giving him the space of not being observed. "Yeah," he said. "Go ahead." Lily peeled the tape and unfolded the brown paper with the focused care she brought to things she sensed were fragile, and pulled out the poster. It was from an American history exhibit, the original, a painted reproduction of a photograph from the early 20th century, a family standing in front of a house in the Midwest, 3 generations, looking at the camera with the specific unself-conscious directness of people who hadn't yet learned how to perform for photographs. Lily looked at it for a long moment. "It's beautiful," she said. "Your mom liked it," he said. Simply, without ceremony. Lily held it carefully and looked at it for another moment, and he watched her do the thing she did with information about Claire. Receive it, hold it, fold it somewhere into herself. She'd never known her mother as a person, only as a presence in stories and photographs, but she treated those fragments with the deliberate respect of someone who understood their value. "Can we put it up in the new place?" she said. He looked across the room at Victoria, who had paused in her wrapping and met his eyes, steady and open, offering nothing except her presence. "Yeah," he said. "We'll find the right wall." Lily carefully rewrapped the poster and put it in the carry pile, the things being transported by hand rather than truck, and went back to her work. Victoria's apartment in Pacific Heights was larger than Ethan had fully absorbed on his previous visits, which had always been as a guest passing through rather than someone mapping it as a home. It had 4 bedrooms, which felt excessive and then immediately felt like exactly enough. There was a study lined with built-in shelves that he recognized immediately as the room where his books would live. There was a kitchen that was significantly more equipped than anything he'd worked in, and that he planned to actually cook in regularly, a prospect that Victoria had received with a mixture of genuine pleasure and slight anxiety about the state of her countertops. Lily's room was the one she'd chosen the previous weekend, a corner room on the second floor with 2 windows and enough wall space for the science project display she'd already started planning. She'd asked for a dedicated shelf unit for her equipment, microscope, filtration supplies, 3 growing trays for whatever the current botanical project was, and Victoria had said yes before Lily finished the sentence, which earned her a significant upgrade in Lily's internal approval rating. The first night in the new apartment, they ate takeout on the floor of the living room because the table wasn't assembled yet, the 3 of them sitting in a loose triangle surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. Lily was operating on the specific elevated energy of change, cataloging everything new, asking questions about the neighborhood, already planning a systematic exploration of the nearby park. At some point, Ethan noticed that Victoria was watching Lily with an expression he'd seen develop slowly over the months. Not the careful, observational attention of the early days, but something softer and less guarded, something that had arrived without her quite tracking when it got there. Lily caught her looking. "What?" "Nothing," Victoria said. "I'm just thinking." "About what?" Victoria considered whether to answer directly, which was visible in her face. "That this is the first time I've lived with other people in about 8 years," she said. "I'm adjusting." Lily thought about this seriously. "Is it weird?" "A little. In a good way." She looked at Lily levelly. "Different from what I'm used to. But I think different from what I'm used to is mostly good." Lily nodded with the judicial expression she used when someone had said something she was filing as reliable information. "I make noise in the morning sometimes," she said. "I try not to, but I forget." "I'm an early riser," Victoria said. "It probably won't matter." "Dad snores occasionally, but he won't admit it. I don't—" "He does," Lily confirmed to Victoria, as though Ethan hadn't spoken. "Not bad. Just enough to know." Victoria looked at him with the precise amusement she kept in reserve for moments like this. "Good to know." "I'm sitting right here," Ethan said. "We know," Lily said. She went back to her takeout. Ethan looked at the 2 of them in the box-cluttered living room of the apartment that was going to be their home, and felt something he'd been slowly learning to accept without immediately bracing for its opposite, the warmth of a thing that was working. Not perfectly, not without its complications, but working, in the way real things worked, with evidence and consistency and the specific ordinary proof of a meal eaten together on a floor. Autumn came, and with it a kind of rhythm that had its own texture, different from anything any of them had lived before. Ethan walked Lily to the school bus stop in the mornings, which was 6 blocks from the Pacific Heights apartment and involved a route through the park that Lily had approved as scenic. Victoria left for her offices early, and sometimes was already in her study when he woke, the light on under the door, the sound of her on a call with someone on the East Coast whose time zone demanded an early start. He learned to read the specific quality of her silences, the productive ones, the frustrated ones, the ones that meant the board situation was unresolved and she needed to talk through it. She learned to read his, the quiet that meant he was grading on deadline and needed not to be interrupted, the quiet that meant something from school had bothered him and he was deciding whether it was worth naming. They bothered each other, not destructively, but the ordinary friction of 2 adults who had both lived alone for years and had formed strong opinions about things like how dishes were loaded and what constituted an acceptable level of counterclutter. There were small arguments, the kind that were technically about the dishes, but were actually about something else, about space, about the right to be who you were in a home you shared, about the ongoing negotiation of 2 independent people trying to stop being quite so independent without losing themselves entirely. One night in October, after a disagreement that had started with the way she'd reorganized his bookshelf without asking and had expanded into a broader conversation about territory and autonomy that neither of them had been quite ready to have. They sat in the kitchen at 10:30 at night, the house quiet with Lily asleep, and said the things that were actually underneath the books. "I moved them because I thought the organization made more sense," Victoria said. She was holding her tea, looking at the table. "Not to assert anything, just because I thought it was better." "It might be better," he said. "That's not the point. The point is you didn't want me touching them without asking. The point is I need to know that there are things in this house that are mine to decide about." He looked at her directly.
Not because I'm drawing territory lines, because I came into this place with very little that was just mine, and I need to know where those things are. She held his gaze. He could see her taking that in and adjusting something. I do the same thing at work, she said after a moment. I see a system that could be better, and I change it. She paused. I don't always think about whether the person who built the original system had reasons for it that I can't see from the outside. Probably. I'll ask, she said. Before I move things,
or change things, I'll ask. And I'll try to tell you when something is mine specifically, instead of assuming you can see the edges of it. They sat with that. Outside, the October fog had arrived, the usual San Francisco night, indifferent and familiar. The bookshelf actually is better, he said, after a while. She looked at him over her tea. I know. He laughed, and she almost laughed, and the disagreement settled into something they'd both keep and use. Lily turned 10 in December, which felt to Ethan like a number that deserved acknowledgement even though he knew it was arbitrary. Double digits. A decade of a person he'd been trusted with and terrified of failing and hadn't failed, not in the ways that counted, not yet anyway. Her birthday dinner was her choice again. Sushi, still a devotion, and Victoria had booked the restaurant without making it into an event, just made the reservation and told Lily the time, and Lily had accepted this as the ordinary fact of having someone in her life who handled logistics with the same calm attention she brought to her science projects. After dinner, walking back through the neighborhood in the cold December air, Lily took both their hands, one on each side, which she'd never done before. It was unannounced and matter-of-fact, the way she did things she'd decided to do. She held both their hands for a block and a half and then let go to point out a cat sitting in a window, and the moment passed the way moments did. But it happened, and Ethan felt it in his chest the way the important things settled there, quiet and permanent. Eleanor Sterling appeared in their lives in January, not as an adversary, but as someone who had decided, in her particular way, to accept the fact of them. She came for dinner. Victoria had invited her, telling Ethan with the careful directness she'd developed about things involving her mother. She wants to come. I think it would be good. Tell me if you'd rather not. He'd said it was fine and meant it because he'd made a decision after the gala conversation at the window that Eleanor Sterling was a person he was going to meet where she was rather than where he'd prefer her to be. She arrived with wine she'd selected specifically, which told him she'd put effort in. She sat at the table in the word still new in a way he was growing into, apartment with the assessing bearing that was simply how she existed in the world, and over dinner she directed most of her conversation at Lily. Not in the performative way adults sometimes talk to children. In the way Ethan had learned Victoria also used, treating Lily as a person whose thoughts were worth addressing directly. She asked about the water filtration project because Victoria had apparently told her about it, and listened to Lily's explanation with actual attention. What was wrong with the methodology, she asked, when Lily mentioned the judge's feedback. The control group wasn't visible in the display, Lily said. I knew about it. I'd run it. But I didn't show it clearly enough. Presentation is 50% of the argument, Eleanor said. The best idea in the room loses if it's not legibly communicated. Lily looked at her with the focused attention that meant she was filing something. That's what Victoria says about investor pitches. Eleanor glanced at her daughter briefly. Something passed between them, a small thing, almost private, and then back at Lily. She learned it from me, she said. Not boasting, just a fact. After dinner, while Victoria and Lily were in the kitchen doing something related to dessert, Eleanor stood at the window with her wine and looked out at the city the way she'd looked out at it that night at the gala, and Ethan came to stand near her with his own glass. She's extraordinary, Eleanor said, meaning Lily. Yeah. Victoria is good with her. She said it neutrally, as though reading something from a document she'd been studying. I wasn't sure she would be. Victoria wasn't around children much. She never had the patience she has now with people she considered. She paused, looking for the precise word. Less efficient. Ethan looked at her. She has patience with Lily because Lily is worth it. I know. I'm saying Victoria knows it too. Eleanor turned from the window slightly. That's not a small thing.
Recognizing what's worth your patience is something some people never learn. She looked at him with the same directness she'd used at the gala.
I was wrong about some of my concerns from last year. He didn't make it easy for her by rushing to accept it. He just held her gaze. I thought the gap was too large, she continued. Not the money specifically. I've never been as unsophisticated as that. But the difference in what you each needed from a life. She looked out the window again. I've reconsidered. What changed your mind? She was quiet for a moment. Watching her in this place, she said simply. She laughs differently than she used to. She's less, she considered the word, managed, less like someone running a long calculation all the time. She looked back at him. That's your doing. He thought about what to say and decided on honesty. It's both of us, he said. I'm different too. Eleanor looked at him for a moment, and in her face there was something that was finally just a person rather than a position. Yes, she said. I suppose you are. The proposal happened on an afternoon in October of the following year, which meant they'd been living together for over a year and had been, in all the ways that counted, a family for longer than that. It was not planned in the way proposals in movies were planned. Victoria would say later that she'd been thinking about it for months, which was true, and that she'd had a specific setting in mind, which had been the restaurant where they'd had their first dinner after the gala, which she'd reserved, and a specific speech prepared, which she'd been refining in her head during early morning runs for approximately 6 weeks. None of that happened, because Lily came home from school on the afternoon in question with a project about family structures in American history, an assignment her teacher had given the class, asking each student to map their own family and explain what made it a family. And Lily had drawn 3 people and labeled them with their names, and then written, underneath, in her precise, slightly adult handwriting, "A family is people who choose each other on purpose." She put it on the kitchen table and went to change out of her school clothes, and Victoria picked it up and read it and stood there with it in her hand when Ethan came in from the hallway. He saw her face immediately. The composure was entirely gone, which almost never happened in ways that were visible, and she was holding Lily's project and looking at it with the expression of someone who had been handed something they hadn't known they needed. Victoria, she looked up. Her eyes were bright in the way that meant she was working to keep something in check and not entirely succeeding. Are you okay? She put the project down on the table carefully. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, I want to marry you. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. I had a plan, she said. The restaurant. A whole... She made a gesture. I had a speech. What happened to it? She looked at Lily's project on the table. She beat me to the point. She looked back at him. I want to marry you. I want Lily to be my family on paper the way she already is in every way that matters. I want... She stopped. He watched her let go of the controlled precision she usually brought to important things and just stand there, in the kitchen of their shared home in the thin October afternoon light, being exactly who she was without the management. I want to stop being almost there and actually be there. He crossed the kitchen. He took her face in his hands the way he'd done a handful of times, the specific gesture of wanting her full attention, wanting her to know he was not going anywhere. Yes, he said. She exhaled, and it wasn't relief exactly. It was the release of something she'd been carrying with a careful tension, finally set down. I had a ring, she said. It's in my office. Go get it. I'm going to. She didn't move immediately. Was the answer actually yes, or were you just, Victoria? He looked at her directly. Yes. She went to get the ring. He stood in the kitchen and looked at Lily's project on the table, the 3 figures, the names, the sentence underneath in her precise handwriting. A family is people who choose each other on purpose. He thought about all the choosing, the Tuesday evening in a coffee shop that he'd almost skipped, the conversation on the Panhandle about trust and small disclosures, the gala and the window and Eleanor asking if he intended to stay, the debt, the 3 days, the Panhandle again. The bookshelf argument at 10:30 at night, the move, the boxes, the museum poster with Claire's fingerprints still somewhere on it. Every one of those was a choice,
and the choosing never stopped. That was the thing people didn't tell you, or told you, and you didn't fully understand until you were inside it. You didn't choose someone once. You chose them in every difficult conversation you stayed for. Every morning you got up and did the ordinary work of a shared life. Every time the scared was there, and you went forward anyway. He thought about Claire, who had taught him what choosing looked like before he'd known how much he'd need to remember it, who had given him Lily and given him, in the manner of her dying, a specific education in impermanence that he'd hated, and that had made him, eventually, into someone capable of understanding what he had. He didn't grieve in that moment. He just held both things, what had been and what was, the way you learn to hold things when you've been living long enough to know that neither one cancels the other out. They married in March, small, as they'd always known it would be. A room at a historic building in the city, not the gala venue, somewhere quieter, with windows that looked out over the bay. 40 people, the ones who counted, Marcus and Rachel. Daniel, who cried before the ceremony even started and didn't apologize for it. A handful of colleagues from each of their lives who had witnessed the process and earned the invitation. Eleanor Sterling sat in the front row and kept her composure for approximately 45 minutes, which was longer than either Ethan or Victoria had expected. Lily stood beside her father during the ceremony, which had been her suggestion and not his, an address she'd chosen herself that was more practical than ceremonial, in the way all her choices were. She held the rings, a responsibility she'd accepted with the gravity she brought to responsibilities she'd decided mattered. And when the moment came to hand them over, she did it with the steady care of someone who understood the weight of what was in her hand. Victoria wore something simple. She'd been offered elaborate things and had declined them all, which surprised no one who knew her. She looked like herself, which was the point. When Ethan took her hand during the ceremony, he felt the slight tremor in her fingers that she almost certainly didn't know was there. He held her hand a little more firmly, not for her benefit specifically. For both of them, the specific human acknowledgement that they were doing something real and knew it and were going to do it anyway. The vows were not the prepared speeches of people performing for a room. They were short and specific and said in the voices of two people talking to each other the way they'd always talked best, direct, without ornament, meaning what they said. He told her that he'd shown up to that coffee shop not expecting anything and had found, by the entirely unremarkable process of being honest with another person, the thing he'd stopped believing he was still capable of wanting, that he was not going to pretend they'd made it easy, or that easy was what he wanted, that he was choosing her specifically, the careful, intelligent, guarded, generous, still learning person she was, and intended to keep choosing her. She told him that she'd spent years building walls she'd been proud of and had found them, in the end, to be less protection than prison. That he'd taught her, by example more than anything else, that the only thing more frightening than trusting someone was living without having tried. That she was choosing him and Lily and the specific, complicated, beautiful shape of the life they'd already been living, and that she was not scared of it anymore. Almost not scared of it anymore, she corrected, which got a laugh from the room and was more honest than the original. Lily, standing beside her father, looked at Victoria when she said that, and something in her face went soft in the way it did when someone had told her the truth, rather than the comfortable version of it. Years have a way of accumulating without announcing themselves. Lily grew, not in the sudden seeming way adults described growth to children, but in the daily, incremental way it actually happened, each year depositing something new into the person she was building herself into. She was, at 13, already more herself than most adults managed to be, with opinions about things that ranged from soil microbiomes to the ethical dimensions of corporate philanthropy, which she developed partly through dinner table conversations with two adults who had strong views and didn't pretend otherwise. She called Victoria Mom for the first time on a Tuesday morning in February, 3 years after the wedding. Not at a significant moment. Over breakfast, asking her to pass the orange juice, she'd said it without looking up from the article she was reading. Victoria had passed the juice and said nothing, and Lily had read her article, and Ethan, who had been standing at the stove and heard it, had turned back to the eggs with the deliberate care of a man not making something into more than it needed to be. Later, when Lily was at school, Victoria found him in the study.
She stood in the doorway and looked at him, and she didn't say anything, just looked at him with the unguarded expression that he'd spent years learning to read. "I know," he said. She nodded slowly, then she went back to her office. That was enough. That was exactly enough. What Ethan understood, in the years of their life together, was something that resisted being made into a lesson because lessons implied clean understanding, and this was not clean. It was the specific knowledge that came from having lost something irreplaceable, and then, against the weight of that knowledge, chosen to build again. The building never felt safe. He wanted to be honest about that because it mattered, because people who talked about love as a destination were leaving out the part where you arrived and found it was not a place but a practice, daily and imperfect and requiring something from you on the days you had it and the days you didn't. He'd loved Claire with the specific wholehearted certainty of someone who didn't yet know what loss was. He loved Victoria with something that had been made partly from the knowledge of loss, a love that understood its own fragility and chose itself anyway. He didn't know which of those was greater. He suspected the question was wrong. What he knew was this. The morning he'd decided not to beg off Marcus's setup, the evening he'd told Victoria he needed a few days and hadn't walked away, the afternoon he'd said yes in the kitchen, every one of those moments had required something from him that he hadn't been sure he had. And every time he'd found he had it, not because he was exceptional, but because the thing in front of him was worth the finding. Victoria's understanding of herself had shifted too, in ways that were visible to him and probably less visible to her. The slow erosion of the managing, the withholding, the pre-protective editing of her life before she let anyone near it. She wasn't cured of anything. She still had the impulse to fix things that weren't hers to fix. She still sometimes went quiet when she should have spoken. But she knew the pattern now, and knowing it had given her a partial choice about it, and partial was more than she'd had before. They had argued over the years with the specific frequency and shape of two people who were both certain they were right and had learned to stay in the room anyway. They had chosen each other, repeatedly and imperfectly, on days when the choosing was easy and days when it cost something real. That was the whole of the story, and it was enough. On a Sunday afternoon in autumn, the particular San Francisco autumn, with the thin gold light and the cold coming in off the bay, and the leaves of the ginkgo trees on their street turned the yellow that appeared for exactly 3 weeks before falling, Ethan sat on the steps of the house with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands. Through the open window above him, he could hear Victoria on a call. The measured, precise voice she used for business, a different register from the one he knew, though the difference had narrowed over the years. From somewhere inside the house, Lily's voice came as well, on her own call, laughing at something, the easy laugh of a teenager who had grown up feeling secure. He sat on the steps and drank the cold coffee and looked at the street. He thought about a man in a frayed jacket standing outside a coffee shop, rehearsing an apology for leaving early. He thought about how much he hadn't known yet, how much there was still to not know, how long that list remained no matter how much you learned. He thought about what Lily had written on a piece of paper for a school assignment, which was still framed on the wall of his study where the museum poster also hung. Claire's poster, finally on a wall, finally home. A family is people who choose each other on purpose. The door behind him opened and Victoria came out with her own coffee, still on her call, and sat beside him on the steps. She was listening to whoever was speaking and looking out at the street, her shoulder against his, the ordinary proximity of people who had stopped noticing it as something to remark on. He looked at the profile he knew by now, the way her jaw set when she was thinking through a problem, the slight line between her brows that hadn't been there when they met, the way the autumn light went in her dark eyes. She glanced at him, mid-call, and something moved in her expression, the specific private acknowledgement between two people who had a whole language that existed only between them. He looked back at the street. The ginkgo leaves fell one at a time, each on its own unhurried schedule, indifferent to the significance of anything, entirely themselves. And the afternoon kept going, the way all afternoons did, carrying them with it into whatever was next. Not safely, not without cost, but forward, and together, and by choice. Which was, in the end, the only way any of it had ever been worth doing.